Therefore, when they were gathered together, Pilate said unto them, Whom will ye that I release unto you, Barabbas, or Jesus, which is called Christ? For he knew that for envy they had delivered him. When he was set down on the judgment seat, his wife sent unto him, saying, Have thou nothing to do with that just man? For I have suffered many things this day in a dream because of him. And this is the word of the Lord.
Now, I have to tell you again, for those of you who weren't here, there may be a little bit of confusion as you open up your Sunday bulletin, because you will have 3 documents in that bulletin. You'll have the notes from Lesson 1, meaning that if you weren't here for the first hour, you can still look at the notes and get an idea of what we went over. You will also find the notes for Lesson 2. But then there's a 3rd document in there for those of you who would like to go a little deeper. I wrote this. It's called a Petition for Writ of Certiorari and Emergency Stay of Relief to the Imperial Court of Rome, where I try to detail all of the errors in the Jewish courts and before the Roman civil courts that were made that would cause reversal by any fair-minded jurist. And so I want you to have opportunity to look at that, to consider that if you wish. Now, this morning we looked at the first trial before Pilate, and it seems as if there was a situation that occurred that transferred this trial. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But I want you to know that from the very onset, Pilate was very uneasy about this situation. Now, most of us would say, wait a second, why would Pilate be uneasy? He's in control. He's the Roman governor. He has the support of the emperor. Well, the emperor at this time was a man by the name of Tiberius. And Tiberius was a great general and a pretty good emperor. But then he decided, I prefer the benefits of being the empire, but not the responsibilities. So I have this trusted friend and advisor named Sejanus. I'm going to put him in charge, and I'm going to go take a vacation to the Isle of Capri. And I may stay there 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, as long as I want to. We'll just let Sejanus run the empire. Now, that's exactly what happened. And Sejanus is the trusted advisor, is running the empire. One of the problems with this advisor is he's dramatically anti-Semitic. And he put into effect a number of rules, laws, and regulations that injured the Jewish people and worked strongly against them. He also decided that he liked being emperor. And so what he started doing was appointing men in prominent positions who were faithful and to him and whom he could trust. One of those men that he appointed was the governor and procurator of the province of Judea by the name of Pontius Pilate. Then, in order to achieve his dream, after bidding all of these men in place, the first thing he decided to do was to hatch a plot to kill the emperor's son, so he wouldn't have anyone to follow after him or to claim the right to being the emperor if something happened to Tiberius. And the son was killed, and Tiberius was convinced that Sejanus didn't have anything to do with it because he was such a trusted and close friend. Well, the next plot, as you can imagine, was to kill Tiberius, so Sejanus could take over as the emperor. Tiberius found out about that plot and had Sejanus arrested and executed. So then the question was, all these men he appointed, are they loyal to me or to him? We're going to have to find out. I may just need to remove them, one of whom was Pontius Pilate. He also came in and reversed the anti-Semitic laws and regulations that Sejanus had put in place. And so mistreatment of the Jews, on at least one occasion, the Jewish leaders complained to the emperor and were successful in their complaint. And Pilate was instructed to do things a little differently. And so I want you to see, first of all, that Pilate was very uneasy, and that is what led him to starting down this road of compromise that he chose to follow. He allowed a man by the name of Barabbas to go free. Now, during the end of this first trial before Pilate, like I said, does not like the situation. He has already pronounced that Jesus is innocent, and the mob is pushing him. He gives them a chance of releasing Jesus or Barabbas, thinking for certain they wouldn't choose Barabbas over Jesus. But when they do, what was he to do? And they came up with this idea. Jesus was from Galilee. So what we need to have is a change of venue. We'll transfer this case over to Herod, who was the tetrarch of the province of Galilee and several other provinces. And they did that. Now, John doesn't tell us very much about what happened there. In fact, he skips it because it's not important for his purposes in writing the Gospel of John. But let me tell you what the Gospel writer Luke said in chapter 23 and verse 11. And Herod and his soldiers, after treating him, that is Jesus, with contempt and mocking him, dressed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him back to Pilate. Concept was, the actions you're complaining of that this man did were done in the province of Judea, and therefore proper venue is not Galilee, but Judea and the capital city, Jerusalem. And now Pilate was stuck. And so John recommences his narrative of this trial, starting in John chapter 19, verse 1. And I think at this point, we need to recognize that not only was Pilate fearful of this situation and this precarious situation, what did Rome expect from him? Two things. Number one, that there would be no interference with the flow of tax revenues, that those revenues would come in consistently to the Roman coffers where they were needed. Secondly, political leaders were even buying votes back then. Secondly, don't cause the empire to have to participate in any policing actions to quiet insurgents or revolts or even attacks by barbarians. We do not want that. So these were the two main mandates. So what was Pilate fearful of? Losing his job? See, the Jewish leaders were threatening an uprising, a revolt, riots in the streets. He had just made the mistake of releasing a known insurrectionist and murderer named Barabbas. Also, you remember his wife had sent him a message. Don't do anything to this man. He is a special man. And so he was very concerned. Now, how do we know that? Well, we just read it, and it's in Matthew chapter 17, verse 19, where you can see that. So, with Pilate's fearfulness in mind, let's consider Jesus' second appearance before Pilate. And we'll start with John chapter 19, verse 1. Pilate then took Jesus and scourged him. Now, what does that mean? And why is Pilate scourging the man he had found innocent in the first half of the trial? Well, there are two words for scourging in the New Testament. The first one is flagelleo. And flagelleo, if you look it up in the lexicon, will tell you it means to scourge. Then there is a second one, mastiguo. Mastiguo, if you look it up in the lexicon, it will tell you it means to scourge. So what is the difference? Well, the Romans had two different ways to scourge a man. A condemned criminal who was sentenced to death would always be scourged before he was put to death. The Romans used a flagrum, which is a scourge. And I want you to see it and understand it. It's a short whip. It's made of 2, 3, maybe more leather oxhide thongs or ropes connected to the handle. And the leather thongs are knotted. They contain pieces of metal or bone, many times zinc and iron, and they're attached at various intervals. The scourging would quickly remove the skin from the recipient's body. Sometimes Romans would put a special surprise on the end of each of these leather thongs. It would be a hook, and they would call that the scorpion. Now what they would do is they would take a man and they would strip him and tie him to a pillar and then commence on each side, striking from one side, and then if there was only one lictor, he'd move around and strike from the other side. If they were two, they would take turns. And this scourging would result in deep lacerations, torn flesh, exposed muscles, excessive bleeding, and leave this criminal half dead. In fact, death was often the result of this cruel form of punishment. But so what they would do is they would take a centurion, a leader of 100, and put him in charge of this scourging. And his job was not to let the guy die, to stop him before he was going to die. Now that's the first word for scourging. The second word, mastiguo, is a little different. It's a lighter scourging. It involves a whip that simply has knots and multiple oxide flailers, but the fact is it doesn't usually result in death. It would hurt a great deal, but there wasn't the ripping or tearing of flesh like in the other form. This was a punishment used for lesser offenses. So the question is, in John 19:1, which word does it use? Which word is it talking about here? Is it the first one, where it's the ripping of the flesh, or is it the second one that's more of just the whipping and the raising of welts? Actually, it's the second one. That is what Pilate started with. Now, could you say, well, now, obviously, if that's the case, Jesus got a lighter punishment than what we thought. It wasn't as horrible for him as we thought if he didn't get that second kind of scourging. Well, that's not the case, because this was before there was a pronouncement of execution. You see, if you read, say, Matthew 27:26 or Mark 15:15, they use the other word. In effect, Jesus was scourged twice. Twice. Twice by his stripes we were healed. Now, why would Pilate do this? This may sound strange to you, but what Pilate was doing was trying to save Jesus' life and save his political life. But save Jesus' life. Really? Yes. He had him scourged the first way, the lighter way. He was planning to display him to the Jewish leaders. They would see that he had been properly humbled and embarrassed and couldn't claim to be a king anymore. And they would say, okay, we agree with you, you can release him. That's what Pilate wanted to do. It was another compromise, because you don't scourge an innocent man. But that was Pilate's plan. Now you say, wait a second. The next verse says, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns. How do you know that was Pilate's plan? Can you read his mind? Just because he scourged him lighter this time doesn't mean that he wanted to get him released. Well, I want you to see Luke 26:16, where it says this. You'll see it in your notes. It says, therefore Pilate said, I will punish him and release him. That was his idea. I'm going to punish him and release him. And once they see him punished like this, you see, he's going to add to that punishment in verse 2. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and put a purple robe on him. Now, first of all, where did they get this robe? Well, Herod had him put that robe on him. Well, then why did they put it back on him? Because it was taken away or taken off of him so that he could be scourged. Now they're putting it back on him with this crown of thorns. And this is a replica of what those crown of thorns would be made of, with the kind of thorns that you find over in Israel. Imagine having that pushed on your head, and then they take a rod and would beat you over the head and crown with it to drive those spikes into your skull. That's what was going on, besides hitting him. But let's see, in verse 3, they said, and they began to come up to him and say, Hail, King of the Jews, and give him blows to the face. In fact, that went on for such a point that if you read John's account of the crucifixion, it said his visage was so marred you couldn't recognize him if you didn't know who he was to start with. It was that serious. And so he shows this plan, and he comes out. When you see this passage where he comes in and he puts the crown of thorns on his head, I want you to ask yourself a question. Where else do we see thorns in the Bible? In fact, let me ask the question this way. When God created the earth and the vegetation on the earth, were there thorns? In Genesis 3 is where you'll find the mention of thorns. Then he said to Adam, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat from it. Now I'm going to stop there because I want to make a point here I want you to see. There's some people say, see, a man should never listen to his wife.
The Pilate would have been better.
Well, let me continue on before you. That is not what this passage is teaching. The passage is teaching you are not, or you should not listen to your wife if she's telling you to do something wrong, but you should always listen to your wife if she's telling you to do something right. For example, Pilate's wife. For example, King Ahasuerus' wife, Esther. Over and over. If David had just kept one wife, Abigail, everything would have been different. But no, he had to have some other, and he listened to them, and that resulted in problems. But going further, you see, what is it? What was his punishment? I'm commanding you, saying, you shall not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you will eat from it all the days of your life, and both thorns and thistles shall grow for you. Now, think about this a second. Whose sin plunged the world into sinfulness and turned this world over to Lucifer? Whose sin? Eve's or Adam's? Adam's. And as a result of that, what came from the ground? Thorns. What was it that evil put on Jesus' head as a crown? Thorns, the picture of the results of sin. And he bore that crown well because he was all about dealing with sin that day. Not his sin, but our sin. One other thing, did you notice as part of the punishment, and you will eat the plants of the field? He turned him into a vegetarian as a result. But we don't have time to talk about that now. So let's go on a little further. I want you to see in John 19, 4 and 5, look what it says. And Pilate came out and said to them, behold, I'm bringing him out to you so that you may know that I find no guilt in him. All right, that's the second not guilty finding in this trial. Jesus then came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said, behold the man. See, Pilate is making a big show out of revealing this beaten man, humiliated King of the Jews. You know, how must Jesus have looked like that? His statement, behold the man, has been written in the annals of infamy, has echoed down through the corridors of history. And yet this was his plan, supposedly, to free Jesus. How do the Jewish leaders and that mob that they've created to follow him respond? Well, let's look. So when the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, crucify him, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, take him yourselves and crucify him, for I found no guilt in him. Third finding of innocence. Why did Jewish leaders react this way? It seems so bloodthirsty, so barbaric. The question is, can you ever mollify evil with compromise? Answer is clearly no. He was hoping, well, I'm going to compromise. I'm going to beat an innocent man so that we can get the result we need. No, didn't happen. Compromise will never come to a good result when you're compromising with evil. Well, wait. Is it fair to say that the Jewish leaders were evil? I think the answer to that is yes, but more importantly, you have to understand that you tend and I tend to look at this at one level, and that's a physical level. One of the things that I really appreciated about the movie The Passion of the Christ was to see Satan walking back and forth and doing the things that he was doing. Don't you remember that he's heavily involved in these events? In John 13:2, it says, during the supper, the devil, having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him. See, he'd been working in the heart of Judas. And then, down in verse 27 of that chapter, and after the morsel, Satan then entered into him. And therefore Jesus said to him, now, did Jesus recognize what Satan had just done? Yes, he's seeing that. That's why he said to him, what you do quickly. Do you not think that Satan was working in the hearts of these Jewish leaders, these Pharisees, people like Annas, who was evil, seriously evil, and Caiaphas, and all the rest? Caiaphas was the one who said, they had a council meeting. And it's in John chapter 11. And all of these Jewish leaders were saying, what are we going to do? This man has just raised Lazarus from the dead. And there were all these people out there witnessing it. Even some of us were there and saw it. What are we going to do? Everybody's going to believe in this man. And that's when Caiaphas stood up and he said, wait a second. You all just don't understand. You don't know how to govern. It's expedient to sacrifice one man for the good of the people. That's what this was all about. Sacrificing an innocent man for them to keep their places, they thought. And all this we did was put the final nail in their coffin, and 40 years later or so, on AD 70, they paid for it, and they paid dearly, as 1 million Jews died at the hands of Titus and Romans. But I want you to see, as you go on, that this evil is working in the midst, just like he's present today and is working in our nation. You need to understand our nation was a gift given to us by God. And it was started by godly men who have set the founding principles on it, on godly principles. And Satan has done everything he could over the last 238 years to chip away. And now we have a country that is full of evil and wickedness and getting worse by the day. Many of you all know that. It's not something new that I'm telling you. But let's go on to verses 7 and 8. And the Jews said to him, we have a law. Now, what are they doing? He's just pronounced him not guilty 3 times of what? Well, sedition, revolt, tax evasion, all of these things they claim. He's innocent. What are they going to do? Now, can a prosecutor change the charge in the middle of the trial? No, you can't do that. But that's exactly what they did. And so they say to him, we have a law. And by that law, he ought to die because he made himself out to be the Son of God. Now, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. Now, what does that verse confirm for us? Well, first of all, a key word here that I want you to see is right down here, even more. In other words, he was already afraid. Now he's even more afraid. Wait a second, this guy's claiming to be the Son of God? Now, it's very interesting to see the question that Pilate is going to ask. He's not going to ask these guys. He's going to go back in, and he's going to talk to Jesus. And he is going to see, do you remember? His wife told him about the dream and that he had, and that Jesus was the Son of God. Don't do anything to this man. Leave him alone, release him. And now he's thinking about ignoring his wife. And so he comes back in, and what question does he ask in John 19:9? And he said, and he entered the praetorium again, and he said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" Now let's stop right there just a second. Why did he ask that question? I think he believes that the correct answer will either confirm or deny his worst fears, that this man is the Son of God. You see, even though you're judging Jesus, you can't be around him without him affecting you. The closer you get to Jesus, the more effect he will have. And so notice, Jesus gave him no answer. You remember the prophecy we read in Isaiah? He didn't say anything. Annas got mad at him because he wouldn't respond to his questions. He didn't have to. The law says you don't have to testify against yourself. It's got to be 2 to 3 other witnesses. But Jesus doesn't answer now. And what's going to happen here is extremely telling. I don't want you to miss it. So Pilate said to him, "You don't speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and I have authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no authority over me unless it was given to you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin." Did Jesus answer his question? I think he did. He answered it right at the end. You would have no authority unless it's given to you from above. How do I know that? Because that's where I come from, above. And now what is Pilate going to do? How is he going to respond? Now, why does Jesus refuse to answer the questions at first? I think Jesus is reading this man's heart, first of all. And he knows whether he's truly seeking to know God or is he seeking just what's in his best interest. He knows Pilate is after his own best interests, and that's what he's doing that. We talked and had a chance to view Isaiah 53:7, and it was prophesied that Jesus would not respond. He wouldn't open his mouth. He wouldn't provide a defense. In fact, Jesus had already told Pilate who he was when he says, "My kingdom is not of this world." He knew where he was from. And there's no question about it if you recall what was in verses 36 and 37 of John chapter 18. And there's another principle, though, I think I want you to see why Jesus is not answering more questions for Pilate. You see, God will reveal a spiritual truth to you, whether you're a believer or an unbeliever. If you accept it, then He'll reveal the next one. But if you reject it, that will be the end of the revelation. You won't get any more. He's already made the revelation to him. My kingdom is not from this world. It's something different. If it was, my servants would be fighting. But I was born a king. That's what I came in the world to be. He's given him the truth, and Pilate rejected it. What is truth? And turned and walked away. And so now, Jesus is not providing him with any more. And Pilate had made it perfectly clear he was not interested in Jesus' truth. Now, I think at this point, maybe it's important before we finish to go a little deeper and to look at this. And here's what I want us to look at. What does the silence of the Lamb portend here? What happens when God chooses to remain silent? Well, has that ever happened before? Actually, it has on a number of occasions. Maybe the most obvious is the 400 years of silence between the Old Testament and the New Testament. There was a period in Job's life where God was silent and did not respond to his prayers. But I want us to consider maybe another silence. That is the silence that God had with Elijah It's in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 1, after Elijah had spent 3.5 years basically in solitude. The first year and a half only by himself, down in a ravine. The second, leaving Israel, going up to the land of the Sidonians, and there spending his time with just a widow and her son. And it says this, now it happened after many days that the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the third year, saying, now go show yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the face of the earth. 3.5 years of silence, no instructions, just stay where you are. What do you do when God's silent? Let me ask you, has anybody here ever experienced God being silent with you, not responding immediately to your requests or your inquiries? I think if we were to know for sure, there would be a number of you who would say, yep, there's been times in my life like that. Well, what do you do? What do you do? I've come up with 5 keys to enduring the silence. The first is this: don't ignore God's silence. Embrace it. Don't ignore it. It may have seemed to Elijah that God was doing nothing, but that was not true. God was waiting for just the right time. In Elijah's life, some of the greatest things that God did to him were done immediately after the silence ended. Same thing is true in Job's life. In fact, you go back to that 400 years, just think what happened after it was over. Coming of John the Baptist and the Son of God. Number 2, during the silence is a wonderful time to confront any sin that's in your life. What do you do if you say, well, I'm not sure there is any sin in my life? First of all, you should recognize there's always sin in your life. But there is someone who is very ready to point it out to you, and I don't mean your spouse. I mean God. You go to him and say, if I say, Lord, I'm not hearing from you right now, so I want to deal with sin in my life. Tell me the things that I need to start dealing with that you will help me not to do anymore. If you think he's going to say, Doug, you're going to have to figure that out on your own. I'm not going to tell you. No, he's not going to say that. He would love to say that and point out to you on a regular basis what your sin is so that you will confess it and develop a repentant attitude and start to change and pursue obedience in your life. The next thing I would like you to look at is go back, during the silence, go back to what you know. That is the truth that God has taught you. What's the last thing God has taught you? Maybe you didn't learn that as well as He wanted you to learn it. Go back to the truths that you know. What should you be doing? You know, my son, I was talking to Barrett just recently, and he said, Dad, I really want to go north. And he shared with us a conversation that he had with God, where Barrett's saying, when can I go? I'm over here. I think I'm ready. And God said to my son, He said, Barrett, what would you say if I told you you had to wait 10 years? Well, then why did you bring me over here to start with now? I could have... You see, He has a purpose in everything He's doing. And then He had to share with my son is, I'm in control. I have just the right time. And so what we need to come to see is we need to know what God has told us to do and act on it. Well, he should be doing something for God where he is, in Seoul, South Korea. It turns out there are children now that he is teaching the Scripture to in English and helping them learn that language. Who knows how God is going to use those kids that Barrett is able to minister to right now. But the next thing I want you to see, the final thing in this keys to enduring the silence, is listen and watch closely. because God is going to do something. He has never remained silent where He didn't do something immediately afterwards. But we have to remember that His ways are higher than our ways. But He did it in Job's life, He did it in Elijah's life, and He did it at the end of that 400-year period of silence. Now, before we finish today, one final thing I want you to think about. If you ponder on what happened here in these trials and what was going on in the spiritual realm, you will begin to see something. And you know what you'll begin to see? If you listen carefully to the questions of Pilate and the answers of Jesus, you'll begin to see it wasn't Jesus who was really on trial. Now, everybody looking there say, well, you're crazy. This is the man who's on trial. No one else is going to be crucified than him. No, he really was not on trial. He was in control of everything that was going on. It was instead the Jewish leaders and Pontius Pilate who were really on trial. They were the ones who were going to either spend eternity away from God or with God, depending on the choices that would make. Now, that would also be true for us. If we are accused of wrongdoing when obeying God. If you are accused of wrongdoing, and that's going to happen in our nation, and it's coming quicker than most of us expect, you need to realize when you're accused that you're not really the one in trial if they're accusing you of doing something that you did in obedience to the Father. We may be tried in many different kinds of courts, even the court of public opinions. But if you understand that the real one who's on trial is your accusers, it makes it easier to say, Father, forgive them, because they don't know what they're doing. Let's close in a word of prayer. Father, I thank you for the time that we could come and open your word together. I pray that you will continue to speak to us through these passages, and that we will remember what it is that you expect from us. Not to compromise with evil, to understand that we will be accused wrongfully just like our Savior was, but to know that you are in control and that you're going to have things happen just the way that you planned, and that you have a plan for everything that's going to happen, and how wonderful it is to be held securely in your hands. I pray these things in the name of your Son, Jesus, and the blood that he shed for me. Amen.